This is Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And joining me, I have a longtime contributor, friend, and colleague, Chris Temple of the National Investor. Welcome aboard, Chris.
Welcome, Mike, and Happy New Year to you and all of our folks out there.
Yes, Happy New Year to you and your new bride.
Thank you.
I'm going to be looking forward to seeing you guys down at the Minds and Money event down in Miami.
For sure.
We're going to do a little bit different today. I'm going to reiterate that none of what we're talking about today should be construed as financial advice. You should do your due diligence. The reason for that was we're going to talk generalities about some strategies that one might want to take a look at. But again, it's not financial advice. You should have a financial advisor. It's, looking after your best interest. But what we wanted to talk about, Chris, is as the headwinds that were blowing into the markets last year don't look like they're going to dissipate anytime soon. What I wanted us to have was a conversation about how to pick winners in a bear market, and you've always been good at that. So I'm gonna turn this over to you.
Well, look, as I said in a commentary that's on the front page of my website, the title, I don't have it right in front of me, so forgive me if I get a word or two wrong, folks, but basically that the great stagflation is going to have more stag in it in 2023 is what I said. And essentially, we, in my opinion, are at only the beginning of what could very well be a multi-year period of time of stagflation, where despite the fact that the high inflation, double digits in England and in the Eurozone by some readings, nearly that in the US, fluttering down some. It's going to soften in the near term somewhat, but we are not going back to 2% inflation anytime soon, barring the Fed and or other central banks throwing us into a serious recession or depression. Therefore, and following, and I'm taking the Fed at face value and believe that they mean what they say. Whether they can stick to it for a long period of time remains to be seen, but they have already told us they're likewise going to keep interest rates high, or certainly high by the standards of recent years for quite some time to come. So not all of this has yet been felt in the economy or in the financial markets, either one. And it's going to be felt more as we get into 2023. We're going to see corporate earnings, generally speaking, hit considerably more than they were last year. We're going to see consumer spending slow down. It's not necessarily going to fall off a cliff because the Fed has this problem that they of their own making right now, Mike, because they created so much money for too long. So there's still somewhat of a cushion in there that's going to keep us from slipping right away into a deep garden variety recession. But things are going to stagnate. And that really still has not come home to rest in the minds of the average investor, who continues to act as if this was all 2022 is a bad dream. Any minute now we're going to wake up, the Fed's going to be printing money anew. We're going to be back to 1 or 2% interest rates, and you can close your eyes and throw money at whatever passive investing strategies you want, and it's going to work. No, it's not. And it's not going to work arguably for some time to come. So, my message to my own audience and anybody who wants to indulge me is that you've got to go back to what worked during past extended periods of whether it was a secular bear market, whether it was past periods of stagflation, like in, most notably, of course, in the late 70s and early 80s, and glimmers of it for, on and off a few times after that, and figure out what works. And the bottom line is that people are going to have to act like investors again. The biggest message I think that people had brought home to them this last year, and I would say it is not an aberration, but it's going to continue for some time to come, is again, the passive investing game has been dealt a serious blow, and you're actually going to have to use your head and invest again and do your homework again. This is not going to be easy anymore.
No, I agree. the tide is not going to wash over every ship equally, nor is it going to raise all ships equally, even in sectors that are going to move upwards in these scenarios. I've always been a big believer in that bear markets are a time when you have to be a stock picker. You can't just buy an entire sector and hope for the best, because it doesn't work that way.
Generally speaking, yes, I would say going forward that you will be able, although you probably do better picking individual stocks within them, you can probably buy entire sectors going forward. You can buy, for example, a URNM ETF that's uranium producers and a few of the hardware and engineering and type companies in the uranium space, and you would do well, I think, because that's something where you are going to see a continued adoption of this resurgence, this renaissance, if you will, of nuclear energy. That's a sector. You know that in the last year I pretty much hit on two themes, and I'm doubling down on both of them in 2023. Number one is my view that we have begun the great stagflation. I explained a little bit about that. And number two, my view about what I've called the new fangs, and sectors like fuel and aerospace, agriculture, nuclear energy, and other carbon reduction forces. And the G, of course, on a new FAANG, last but not least, stands for gold. And you can look at other metals and minerals in there as well. And, broadly, Mike, especially in the metals and stuff, you're not going to see them all perform equally. Copper, as you and I talked about before we started recording, is all of a sudden out of nowhere had a big spurt to start 2023 with. I think there's a few different reasons for that. Of course, the long-term secular tailwinds for copper and the fundamental story could hardly be better than it is. It's been depressed for a while for a few reasons. Some of those reasons are dissipating, but I think that you need to look again as we get deeper into this new bear market, deeper into a new world where we're going to have continued and heightened jockeying over currencies, over who is ruling the roost over what and whom, over commodity supplies, all of the different parts of the resource nationalism and critical minerals and so forth that go with that. And even though we are likely to see the broad stock market at best grind lower slowly for a while and then maybe bottom and flatline for a while, there are going to be some areas and some sectors that do extremely well, where you've got pricing power, where there are shortages of the things that we need, etc. So, an analogy that I've liked to make, Mike, is that if you go back to the one of the last times we had a bubble in 2000, the bubble started to lose its air. You had it was a better part of 3 years that it took for the stock market to bottom. But you only had to go about halfway through that, give or take, depending on the sector you're talking about. And entire sectors were starting to turn around. And they did it for two reasons. One was that investors got it through their heads that the collapse in the .com stocks that started in 2000 was not an aberration. This was a dynamic that we were going to have to deal with for a while, and they got to live with it. And so once they got that through their heads, they said, okay, the world isn't going to end, and we still have money to invest. We still need to put money to work. What do we do? And it actually got a bit easier during that bear market because you already knew all the stuff you needed to stay away from until it bottomed. So by process of elimination, you look out there and say, okay, what makes sense? And of course, belatedly, Alan Greenspan, who was Fed chairman back in those days, of course, finally decided to start loosening credit, reducing interest rates. And a year or longer before the final bottom for the broad stock market in the latter part of 2002, you could be buying REITs, utilities, energy, commodities, gold, didn't matter what, and you made money. Now, I don't think all of the same individual dynamics are going to be present this time, but I think the same mindset will be, and in some sectors already is. And as this year goes on, I think that the epiphany will hit investors again that 2022 was not a bad dream or an aberration, that these issues we've dealt with for the last year are going to stay with us for a while. And now we just need to come to grips with that and decide, okay, what do we do sensibly to invest our money, which we still want to do, and what areas are going to weather this storm, what sectors are going to continue to do well, even if in 2023 this S&P goes down to 3,000.
I would agree with that, and it's interesting you mentioned the new fangs, because one of the things that I think people need to be running away from rapidly is the old fangs. I think they are going to be hit pretty significantly with the downturn in the economy and overall.
Well, they'll be hit with a downturn in the economy. They've already seen their share prices go down quite a bit. If you look at the old fangs, of course, that's Facebook, or they want to call themselves Meta these days, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. As a group, they more than doubled the loss in the S&P 500 last year. Now, it doesn't mean any of the companies are going to go out of business anytime soon, but it means their growth has long since matured. They're going to be, and just to overgeneralize, quasi utilities themselves going forward. And as consumer spending starts to get crimped even more, it's not going to do any of them a whole lot of good. So the last thing you would say that these kinds of outfits are going to have right now is pricing power. So their revenues are the revenue growth, such as it is, will slow down. Their earnings growth will slow down, maybe decline more in some cases. And again, these companies will be with us probably until you and I are long since feeding the worms. But their best days are over with, and they're yesterday's news.
Yeah, companies do have a tendency to reach that maturity level, and as you say, they become more of a utility than growth companies. Microsoft would be a prime example of that, where
Sure.
Microsoft basically, for all due in fact, it's a utility that we use to operate our computer systems anymore, and
Right.
Apple to some degree, although most of Apple's growth came from the phone sector, but same general idea.
Right. So again, nothing against any of them. They're great big companies. They're going to stay great big companies for as far ahead, most likely, as you want to look. But again, they're the old fangs. They're yesterday's news. What we want to look for going down the road is the new fangs. What are the industries that are going to produce the next examples of these kind of juggernaut companies? And there's a lot of candidates out there. When you look at the new fangs themes, when you look at the world where population is still growing, there's a greater desire and need for people the world over to be brought in the middle class, but now it's got to be done more efficiently. Now it's got to be done with better use of energy. Now it's got to be done in a more environmentally friendly way. And there are so many of these new Nesbitt one time wrote about the megatrends. There are so many megatrends now that people are writing about, piecemeal. Correct me if I'm wrong, I've not seen one really good source that talks about all of these things going forward, about sustainability and the environment and human capital and better qualities of life independent of money. And all these different kind of things that I think the world is going to be embracing more going forward.
I think so too. I think one of the factors that we're seeing with the end of globalization is a move back towards what I would refer to as community, where people are going to start to look more in their own backyard as to what's going to be there to sustain them and move them forward, as opposed to, okay, well, we just get that from China, as an example.
Oh yeah, and I mean, there's umpteen reasons why, and they run the gamut from the good of people overtly wanting to get to know their neighbors and support their own communities better. There's some unfortunately not so good things in there where there's still a lot of intrigue between nations as far as the people who run the levers of power that could start wars over some of these kind of things we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, there's, globalization yet here again is another thing that's yesterday's news, and we are going to see the world going forward continue to fragment. Don't forget, folks, that, and I'm going to talk about just one of several examples, but look at natural resources. Okay, we all know that the U.S. acutely has put itself into a very bad place by having an outsized dependence on countries like Russia, China, Kazakhstan, and some others for natural resources of various kinds. And that was a decision made, in a number of ways with a number of moving parts. Now we're realizing that, okay, just because we can get something cheap someplace else doesn't mean that's the best course of action. I mean, look what our President Biden just did. A guy who he and his party are always talking against the exploitation of minorities, right? So what does he do? He sets himself up as an absentee plantation owner, one step removed, and decides to do a deal with the Democratic Republic of Congo to get battery metals for U.S. companies produced by child labor over there under very bad conditions that the whole world knows about, but he doesn't care. Because there's still this mentality in some places that we can, we're so big and tough and wonderful that we can command these resources from other places, and that, maybe he's going to get away with that for a while, but that game is coming to an end. So it's doing it for those kind of reasons. Human rights. I can't believe that Biden is not being pilloried over this by his own left supporters in this country, but racism is okay when it's a Biden and a Democrat doing it, I suppose. But look at just some of the carbon things and the international tax things and stuff like that. These people that have set up this new rulemaking apparatus in the world, you're penalized. I mean, again, let me stick with the example of the U.S. All else being equal, the farther away you bring in nickel, cobalt, whatever from other countries, the more of a tax is going to be levied on those things. So even from that, which I guess to some extent makes sense, because you should be paying more to ship something a farther distance as opposed to getting it from your own backyard where you're not burning up the fossil fuels to get it from a mine in Nevada or Idaho or BC or Ontario to Detroit. That's cheaper to do that and smarter, and we're doing it in first world ways here rather than bringing stuff from the Congo or from Australia or from Southeast Asia. Indonesia's a favorite subject of people that like to talk about how you've got all kinds of, for example, nickel, but it's an environmental basket case, how it's mined. So a lot of this stuff is going to change. And I think that people that understand these trends, understand the new fangs, understand, though, that there's going to be more of a demand for all of the future growth, whether it's green energy, otherwise, it's got to be done responsibly. There's a lot of sectors and a lot of companies getting out in front of this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There are. As you were describing the U.S. buying their cobalt from the Congo, I was back in London at the end of November at an ESG panel, breaking hearts when I said when push came to shove, if they needed the cobalt, they wouldn't care about ESG. They would go to the Congo and get it.
Yeah,
sometimes it sucks. Sometimes it sucks to be right. That's all I can say.
Well, and that's the hypocrisy, and that is still to a great extent this idea that, and maybe there's a good side, maybe there's not a good side, I don't know, but this is the old NIMBY complex, not in my backyard. Okay, all of these people at Martha's Vineyard and or Miami or wherever, they all want to drive Teslas, they all want to crow about how wonderful they are, but they don't want to see how the sausage is made, proverbially speaking. And I think that we need to, as a country and as a society and as a culture, have this conversation in a lot more realistic way and say, look, if we really want this stuff, then here's the pros and cons. Here's the pluses and minuses. All right. It was, I think, about a week or so ago that there was the final court hearing here in the U.S. over the Thacker Pass, Nevada, big lithium project. And there are forces that are opposing that do not want what I mean, and I've not followed this closely, and if you know something more than me, please correct me on this, Mike. But you are talking about, with that particular lithium resource, a pretty significant footprint. I mean, environmentally, as far as an oversized strip mine. This is going to be like the old stories from years past. I think of taking mountaintops off in West Virginia for the coal. So as a society, we need to say, okay, are we willing to pay that price and suck it up and have lithium resources within our own four walls that we're willing to develop? And at some cost, we try and mitigate the environmental part of that as best we can, or are we going to be hypocrites and say, well, we don't want to do it here, but we'll make Canada do it, or we'll make Argentina do it, or somebody else do it. Both political parties and almost everybody involved has not really been that realistic in how we've gotten to this place of we want this, we want this, we want this, without understanding the cost in time and in money and in environmental degradation and everything else. And long before this, we should have had a national conversation, and then Canada as well, about how we're going to get to this utopian green economy of the future that these people all want, and which I'm not necessarily all opposed to, for that matter, but it's got to be done intelligently, and it hasn't been to this point. So I think as time goes on, getting back to the point of our whole conversation, as some smarter, more realistic policymakers get involved, as some of the big companies are going to be involved in this, step up to the plate a bit more, we're going to see the wheat separate from the chaff, so to speak, and we're going to see who is going to be leading us in the future in these areas. A lot of them are going to be heads of companies who we're going to want to follow. We're going to want to look at who they glom onto, and that's where a lot of your investment themes to come are going to come from.
Yeah, no, definitely. I see the new green economy as being the internet when it first started. There'll be like this initial wave, there'll be a collapse, and then those that had real products and a real sense of a business plan will come out of the second wave of it. And that's where you'll find your Apples and Microsofts of that green economy going forward.
That's a great analogy. I agree.
But in the meantime, we still have to kind of figure out who the leaders are in this first wave. That's almost like shock troops going over onto the beach.
Yeah, in a way it is. That's true.
So we talk about lithium. I am of the position that I have not felt as though the lithium ion battery is going to be the green solution. What that new solution will be, I do not know. I'm not an engineer, but I keep seeing the challenge. And the challenge is that if you have an electric car, your battery gets you about 200-300 kilometers. Sorry, I'm a Canadian, so a couple hundred miles for you worth of distance. And then you got to plug it in, and it's going to take you an hour to charge it. If I've got a gas powered car, let's be friendly and green and say I have a hybrid. I'm going to be able to get about 450 to 500 if I'm on the highway, upwards to 600 kilometers to a tank of gas. And it's going to take me approximately 5 minutes to fill the tank. And I'm looking at that amount of distance and that amount of time. And I think that is the real challenge to the battery industry, to get the green electric vehicles to be readily accepted. I think you need to get batteries that are going to have a longer capacity and are going to be able to be charged quicker, so that they can actually compete head to head with the gas powered engines. Your thoughts?
Well, I agree. And look, I think that they're going to get there. If you look at the very first electric vehicles that were put on the road several years back and compare them to one coming off the the lines today, it's a considerably better vehicle. A lot of the Teslas, for example, I think some of them are getting 300 to 400 miles, depending on the conditions, when it's charged, depending on the weather and terrain and things like that. And will probably improve a bit more still. I would look at it, Mike, from a bit different of an angle. And here again, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, this is where we've not had a sensible conversation about this as a society, as an economy, as a country. In the U.S., I'm speaking for, but if you go for up there too, I'm sure, about over just what is real, what can be expected. This idea that a President Biden or somebody else throws out a number. Oh, I want X number of X number of cars that come off the assembly line by 2030 to be electric vehicles. Well, that makes no sense to come up with a number like that, because all you're doing now is pandering to a political constituency that thinks that that's where we need to go, but they don't have the slightest idea either how to get there financially, engineering wise, economically, supply chain wise, or any other way. We should be real and say, okay, let's do, and President Trump, who, I was not always a fan of, I will say this, that the best part, the best work out of his administration was with Rick Perry, and then shortly after, when he left, Dan Brouillette, who ran the energy department here, because they had an all of the above approach. And when you're talking about transportation going forward, you need the internal combustion engine, more efficient ones maybe, but you need that. Electric vehicles are fine in isolated areas within cities, over short distances for people who maybe live 10 miles out of town and are retired, and every now and then run back and forth to town. Maybe they only need to charge their Tesla or whatever up once a week. They can do it at home. But this idea, this notion that you're going to, just because it's such a wonderful thing and we hate gas and oil so much, you're going to give everybody a Tesla. And forgive me for leaving out the Fords and everybody else that's coming out with EVs also. But you're going to get, we use it, we're Tesla like Xerox for copy, right? But everybody's going to have a Tesla, and you're going to take your vacation and leave Florida and drive out to the Rocky Mountains. That's asinine. And that's not going to be a realistic and convenient thing to do for a very, very long time. So let's have the all of the above approach, do it sensibly, and say, yes, there's a place for electric vehicles, particularly as they get more efficient, but we're never going to do away with internal combustion engines or petroleum or gasoline. And furthermore, and particularly here in the US, we are woefully behind places like Europe and Japan in mass transit. There's a lot of things that can be done to reduce carbon emissions and so forth by going much more to mass transit, to high-speed rail and stuff like that. So, we got to this place where so many people think that EVs are the solution to everything, in the same way that we got to where we did with all these subsidies for solar power and wind power, because they're going to be the be all and end all, and all of a sudden the realization is hit that, okay, their benefits are going to be very limited, and you're never going to change that until you learn how to have the sun shine directly on solar panels 24 hours a day, and that ain't going to happen. Or have the wind blow 24 hours a day favorably, and that may not happen either.
So this kind of goes along with what I was saying before. Some of these industries are going to be those shock troops as we head into the green economy. Like, and I'm not going to pick on Tesla, But let's say the lithium battery industry, maybe that's one of those areas. Electric cars maybe isn't the answer, but mass transit's going to be. Wind and solar maybe it's not the answer. Uranium. So as we're heading through these bear markets and the economy is shifting and changing, should we still be speculating on the shock troops, or should we be looking at the next level, such as the mass transit companies, such as the uranium companies going forward?
Well, I think you can do both, Mike. It's a little bit difficult. We'd have to spend a lot of time talking about individual themes within energy and stuff like that. I think uranium is a ship that's already leaving the dock, frankly. I mean, the whole world is getting on board with this. Every time you turn around, there's an announcement that somebody else is going to extend the life of their existing reactors. Bill Gates and Buffett, their company, TerraPower, even though they've had to delay the start of their first natrium plant out in, I think it's Wyoming, for a couple of years because they can't get enough enriched uranium. They're still looking elsewhere. In fact, I mentioned the West Virginia coal country. Apparently, they've got their eye on another, their potentially second facility in West Virginia. So, that's definitely something that's not too early to bet on. They're not the shock troops, and to the extent that they were for a while, they now are part of the future, in my opinion, the nuclear energy industry. So there'll be more. I mean, the whole hydrogen thing is confusing to me, and I think that some of the claims are unrealistic. The Department of Energy down here recently was ballyhooing some research success on fission. But anything workable for the economy is many years down the road still. So it's an exciting time in a way, because especially now as an investor or looking at the investment markets, when you realize that you can't just throw money at any old ETF, the garden variety fashion, and expect to do well. There's the economy is evolving, new themes are emerging, old ones are dying. You got to keep up with that. And so I think there's going to be a lot of things to choose from. It's going to take a lot of homework. But I am not pessimistic as an investor looking forward, and quite honestly, I think that this kind of an environment is a much better one if you actually are a traditional investor.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of those situations where there's innovation coming back to the economy in different areas. We're going to have to innovate in order to solve some of these, existential problems with regards to the environment, with regards to energy issues, in regards to a lot of things. And when there was so much free money, what was happening, it seemed to me, was a lot of companies were getting money from the banks and turning around and just buying their shares back and not really innovating into any new products. And that's the sign of a mature company that's moving to utility, as we had discussed earlier, and there didn't seem to be so much in the innovation end of things. And I think we're going to see a time now where there's more and more innovation, and it's going to be exciting, and it's going to be exciting for investors.
Well, it is. I mean, you follow my newsletter, and I'm not going to mention any names, at least in this particular context, but I've got companies I follow that not only in resources, but one that's got the next advancement in breast cancer detection, a company that's farther ahead than anybody else pretty much in looking for a cure for type 1 diabetes. So the best company, in my opinion, that's got an Alzheimer's drug, which has been in the news a lot recently. And I mean, environmental remediation, so many things. So thankfully, for however much policymakers, elected officials, and central bankers screw things up regularly, we still have human beings out there that are smart, that are driven, and are bringing us, the marvels of tomorrow. And this is a great time to be shopping for them.
Yeah, and I always find that in spite of government and regulators and central banks, the markets tend to find the wins.
That's right.
ultimately. But that goes into another philosophical discussion about unfettered markets. So and we've already been going at this for over a half an hour.
Yeah, we'll leave that for the folks for another day.
You know what? I think we're going to have to make this a two-part conversation and come back to it. Let's plan to do another one of these next week, and we'll get into more specific sectors and areas that we should be looking at as we start to pick those winners in a bear market.
Sounds
Chris,
great,
if people wants to get a hold of you and to follow your writings, how would they do so?
Best way to do it is simply go to my website, nationalinvestor.com. If you're not on my mailing list already and you sign up for my free mailing list, among other things that you'll get will be the recent special issue on precious metals that I did. And the title of that is This Is Not Your Father's Gold Market. So that'll come to you. There's several of the companies I presently recommend are listed in there. And for those that like social media, follow me on Twitter, and my handle there is @NatInvestor. So national is just abbreviated to Nat, but @NatInvestor on Twitter.
Wonderful. I look forward to continuing with this chat next week. Thanks, Chris.
Me too. Take care, Mike.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.